"Some children don't forget how to smile," people whispered. "They simply stop believing there's a reason." For nearly 2 years, everyone inside Blackwood Manor had accepted one heartbreaking truth. 5-year-old Noah Blackwood, the only son of the city's most feared Mafia Alpha, had never smiled again after losing his mother. The sprawling estate overlooking the gray Atlantic coastline had everything money could buy, from marble halls and private gardens stretching across several acres to a security team that worked around the clock. Yet no amount of wealth could restore the light that had vanished from the little boy's face. Specialists flew in from New York, Boston, and Chicago. Child therapists filled entire shelves with reports. Famous teachers brought books, music, and games. None of it mattered. Noah barely spoke. He answered every question with a silent nod or a distant stare through the mansion's enormous windows, as though he were waiting for someone who would never come home. Damian Blackwood watched it happen every day. The powerful alpha who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without raising his voice found himself powerless each evening when he sat outside his son's bedroom door, listening to the unbearable silence inside. The staff feared Damian's reputation, but what frightened them even more was seeing their boss carry a tiny dinosaur blanket from the laundry room himself because Noah refused to let anyone else touch it. Every servant understood one rule: never force the young master to interact with anyone. That morning, the head housekeeper announced a new hire. Ethan Carter arrived just after 8 o'clock, wearing a neatly pressed uniform that had clearly been altered to fit him. He carried one worn diaper bag over his shoulder and balanced a sleepy 10-month-old baby on his hip. Ethan apologized 3 separate times before even crossing the front entrance, embarrassed that childcare arrangements had fallen through at the last minute. He promised the baby would stay quiet and insisted he would leave immediately if it caused any inconvenience. The senior staff exchanged nervous glances. Bringing a baby into Blackwood Manor was unheard of, but the estate had been desperately short-handed, and Ethan's references were excellent. After a brief phone call, Damian approved the exception with only one condition: the child must never wander near Noah. Ethan thanked everyone repeatedly, relieved beyond words. His son, Oliver, seemed far more interested in the sparkling chandelier than the tense adults surrounding him. Throughout the morning, Ethan worked carefully, dusting shelves, organizing books, and quietly learning the endless routines of the enormous house, while Oliver rested in a portable playpen nearby. Surprisingly, the baby almost never cried. Instead, he smiled at every passing employee as though the unfamiliar mansion were simply another exciting place to explore. Shortly before noon, while Ethan folded fresh towels in the east hallway, a maintenance worker accidentally left a side gate unlatched. No one noticed Oliver had learned to crawl faster than anyone expected. By the time Ethan turned around, the playpen was empty. His heart nearly stopped. He rushed into the hallway calling his son's name, panic rising with every step. Around the next corner, sitting beneath a sunlit window at the end of the corridor, Noah Blackwood remained exactly where he always spent his afternoons, quietly reading without turning a page. A few feet away, little Oliver crawled across the polished hardwood floor with complete confidence. Several housekeepers froze where they stood. One guard instinctively reached forward before another silently grabbed his arm, remembering the standing order never to disturb the young master. Ethan held his breath, terrified he had already lost the job he desperately needed. Oliver finally reached Noah, looked up with bright blue eyes, and stretched out one tiny hand toward the lonely little boy who had forgotten how to smile. Time itself seemed to stop. Oliver giggled as though he had discovered a new friend instead of the most unreachable child in the mansion. His tiny fingers rested against Noah's hand without fear, without hesitation, and without expecting anything in return. Every employee watching from the hallway held their breath, convinced the fragile moment would end the way every other attempt had ended, with Noah quietly pulling away and retreating into himself. Instead, something impossible happened. The corners of Noah's lips lifted ever so slightly. It was not a loud laugh or an excited grin. It was a small, hesitant smile, almost as though he had forgotten how the expression felt. Yet it was unmistakable, a genuine smile. One of the housekeepers gasped so softly, she immediately covered her mouth. Another quietly wiped tears from her eyes before anyone could notice. Ethan could not move. His heart pounded against his chest, as relief mixed with disbelief. He had been terrified that Oliver had crossed a line that would cost him the only stable job he had managed to find in months. Instead, his cheerful little boy had accomplished what no specialist, no expensive toy, and no carefully planned therapy session had managed to do in nearly 2 years. Noah slowly lowered the picture book that had remained unopened in his lap. For the first time all morning, he looked directly at another child instead of through the windows overlooking the gardens. Oliver responded with another happy sound and clapped his tiny hands together. Noah blinked once, then reached out with careful uncertainty and touched Oliver's sleeve as though confirming the baby was real. At that exact moment, Damian Blackwood stepped into the hallway after finishing a business call. He immediately noticed the unusual silence. His security team stood perfectly still. The household staff looked frozen. Then he followed every pair of eyes toward his son. Damian had spent hundreds of evenings wishing for this single moment, yet when it finally appeared before him, he almost convinced himself he was imagining it. Noah was smiling. It lasted only a few seconds before the expression faded into quiet curiosity, but for Damian, those few seconds felt more valuable than every fortune he had ever built. He approached slowly, careful not to interrupt whatever invisible thread connected the two children. Noah glanced at his father, but did not retreat. Instead, he looked back at Oliver, who was happily trying to hand him a small plush rabbit that had fallen from the diaper bag. Noah accepted it with both hands. Damian had not seen his son willingly accept a gift from anyone since the funeral. Ethan quickly apologized, his voice trembling. He explained that Oliver had escaped while he was working and promised it would never happen again. Damian surprised everyone by shaking his head. His expression remained calm, but something in his usually distant eyes had changed. He looked at Ethan for only a brief moment before speaking quietly. "Do not apologize." The hallway fell silent once again. Damian turned toward the head housekeeper. "Prepare one of the family guest suites for Mr. Carter and his son. Effective immediately, they will remain here full-time until further notice." Ethan stared in complete shock. "Sir, I cannot possibly accept something so generous." Damian looked back at Noah, who was still sitting beside Oliver without a trace of discomfort. "This is not generosity," he answered evenly. "This is the first time my son has looked happy in years. I am simply refusing to let that disappear." As the words settled over the hallway, no one noticed Noah quietly scoot a few inches closer to Oliver, holding the little plush rabbit against his chest as though he had finally found something worth protecting. The atmosphere inside Blackwood Manor changed almost overnight. For years, the mansion had been known for its flawless order and overwhelming silence, but now tiny footsteps and cheerful laughter occasionally echoed through the endless hallways. Oliver had become the only person Noah willingly approached without encouragement. Every morning, after breakfast, Noah quietly walked to the family's sitting room and waited by the window until Ethan carried Oliver downstairs. The moment the baby saw him, his face lit up with excitement, and Noah always answered by taking one cautious step closer than he had the day before. No one dared interrupt those moments. Even the housekeeping staff learned to dust another hallway rather than disturb the strange but beautiful routine. Damian watched everything from a distance. He never interfered, but he noticed details no one else seemed to see. Noah had started eating more of his meals. He no longer pushed away his favorite blue blanket every evening. He even began placing the stuffed rabbit beside Oliver whenever the baby crawled across the playroom floor, as though sharing had become natural again. Those changes were small enough that an outsider might overlook them, yet to a father who had spent 2 years watching his son disappear into silence, they felt extraordinary. During one quiet afternoon, Damian called his longtime advisor, Christopher Hayes, into his private office. Christopher had served the Blackwood family for nearly 20 years and understood that when Damian spoke softly, the matter was often more serious than when he raised his voice. Damian stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens where Noah and Oliver sat on a blanket beneath a large maple tree. Ethan remained nearby, folding fresh laundry while keeping one attentive eye on both children. Damian finally broke the silence. "Tell me everything you can find about Ethan Carter." Christopher looked surprised. "Sir, the employment agency already completed a background check." Damian nodded once. "I have read it." Christopher waited. "It tells me where he worked. It tells me where he rented apartments. It tells me how much he earned. It tells me nothing about the man himself. Christopher glanced toward the garden. You think there is something unusual? Damien remained silent for several seconds before answering. Noah has ignored the world for 2 years. In 3 days, he trusts Ethan's son more than anyone else. That is not something I am willing to dismiss as coincidence. Christopher carefully chose his next words. Would you like a discreet investigation? Damien answered without hesitation. Quietly. No intimidation. No pressure. I want facts, not fear. If Ethan has struggled through difficult circumstances, I do not want us making them worse. Christopher nodded, genuinely surprised by the unusual instruction. Damien was known for demanding precise information, but rarely did he emphasize kindness. After Christopher left, Damien remained by the window. Outside, Oliver lost his balance while trying to stand beside a garden bench. Before Ethan could react, Noah instinctively reached out and steadied the baby with both hands. Oliver rewarded him with another delighted laugh, and this time Noah smiled without hesitation. It lasted longer than before. Damien felt something loosen inside his chest, a weight he had carried every single day since losing his wife. Yet another question quietly formed in his mind. Why did his son respond only to Oliver? That evening, Christopher received the first report from a trusted investigator. The file contained nothing alarming. Ethan had never been arrested, had never caused trouble, and had earned an excellent reputation everywhere he worked. But one sentence near the end caught Christopher's attention before he carried the folder upstairs. According to every available public record, Oliver Carter had no registered father, and several years of Ethan's life before the baby was born seemed to have disappeared without explanation. Christopher placed the investigation file on Damien's desk just after sunrise. The report was surprisingly thin for someone who had lived 25 years. Ethan Carter had worked as a caregiver, a bookstore assistant, a hotel housekeeper, and eventually accepted temporary domestic jobs across several states before arriving at Blackwood Manor. Every former employer described him the same way: honest, quiet, dependable, compassionate. Yet there was an unusual gap that covered almost 4 years. During that period, Ethan seemed to vanish completely from every public record before reappearing with an infant son and a modest apartment on the outskirts of Boston. There were no police reports, no lawsuits, no debts, and no obvious explanation. Damien closed the folder without speaking. He had spent most of his life learning that people usually hid something because they feared losing everything they loved. That thought made him hesitate before drawing any harsh conclusions. Meanwhile, the mansion settled into a new rhythm. Noah no longer waited alone by the window each morning. Instead, he quietly walked toward the nursery that had been prepared for Oliver and stood outside until Ethan opened the door. He never knocked. He simply waited with remarkable patience, holding the stuffed rabbit against his chest. The first time Ethan invited him inside, Noah looked uncertain, but Oliver immediately crawled toward him with a delighted laugh. Within minutes, the two children sat side by side on a soft rug surrounded by wooden blocks. Oliver happily stacked them into uneven towers while Noah silently rebuilt each one after it collapsed. It was the longest anyone had seen the young heir remain engaged in play since his mother passed away. Ethan often found himself watching Noah with quiet concern. The little boy rarely spoke, yet every expression in his eyes carried emotions far beyond his years. One afternoon, Ethan gently offered him a homemade blueberry muffin that he had baked after finishing breakfast preparations. Noah accepted it without hesitation. A nearby maid nearly dropped the basket she was carrying. The child had refused homemade desserts from nearly everyone in the house for more than a year. Word of these small miracles spread through the estate until even the gardeners smiled whenever they saw the children together. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. During an afternoon tea gathering in the West drawing room, several older relatives of the Blackwood family arrived for a routine visit. Their polite smiles quickly faded when they learned that a newly hired Omega maid and his baby had been invited to live inside the family residence. They exchanged subtle glances that did not escape Damien's notice. One elderly aunt finally spoke with practiced courtesy. "It is generous to help loyal employees, Damien, but becoming emotionally attached can complicate important decisions." Damien calmly stirred his coffee. "What decision has become complicated?" The woman smiled politely. "Your son is the future of this family. Attachments should be carefully chosen." Damien followed her gaze toward the garden, where Noah and Oliver chased floating soap bubbles that Ethan had made using nothing more than dish soap and warm water. For the first time in years, Noah laughed softly as one bubble landed on the tip of his nose before drifting away in the afternoon breeze. Damien answered without looking back at his relatives. If a child can give my son something that money, influence, and every expert in the country could not, then I consider that child a blessing, not a complication. The room fell silent. No one argued further, but Damien noticed the thoughtful expressions around the table. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, Christopher quietly returned with one additional envelope. "Sir," he said carefully, "there was one thing the investigators almost overlooked. 3 days before Mrs. Blackwood passed away, she requested access to an archived family file. The file number appears in the records." Damien looked up immediately. What was the file about? Christopher hesitated before answering. That is the strange part. The archive register confirms the request existed, but the file itself disappeared years ago. Damien could not stop thinking about the missing archive. His late wife had been meticulous, the kind of person who labeled every family photograph and organized every important document twice. If she had requested an old file only days before her passing, it had never been a random decision. He instructed Christopher to continue searching quietly while keeping the investigation away from the rest of the family. The fewer people who knew, the better. Life inside the manor continued with a warmth no one had expected. Noah now followed Ethan through the kitchen during breakfast preparations, carefully carrying napkins or setting spoons beside each plate with complete concentration. Oliver crawled behind him, laughing whenever Noah pretended to hide around a corner before stepping back into view. The game was simple, but every tiny laugh from both children filled the once silent mansion with something the staff had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Ethan often thanked everyone for their kindness, insisting he and Oliver had already received more generosity than they deserved. The older housekeepers smiled whenever they heard him say that because they knew the truth. It was Ethan and Oliver who had changed the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor, not the other way around. One crisp Saturday morning, Damien decided to take Noah and Oliver to the private botanical garden behind the estate. Ethan walked several steps behind them, carrying snacks and juice while Noah proudly pushed Oliver in a small stroller along the stone path. Christopher remained nearby out of habit, although the outing felt more like a family walk than a security assignment. As they reached the rose garden, an elderly groundskeeper named Walter approached with a warm smile. Walter had worked for 3 generations of the Blackwood family and rarely commented on anything unless he considered it important. He watched Oliver reach both hands toward a butterfly before turning to Damien. "Sir," Walter said quietly, "I have never seen Master Noah this peaceful." Damien nodded without taking his eyes off the children. "Neither have I." Walter hesitated before adding another thought. "There is something unusual about that little one. Every person who spends time around him seems calmer without realizing it." Damien did not answer immediately, but he remembered similar observations from several employees over the past week. The kitchen staff argued less. The younger gardeners laughed more. Even Noah slept through the night for the first time in months whenever Oliver had spent the afternoon playing beside him. Ethan had noticed none of it because he was too busy caring for everyone else. That afternoon, Christopher received a phone call from one of the investigators. The missing years in Ethan's history remained impossible to verify, but another discovery had surfaced. Shortly before Ethan disappeared from public records several years earlier, someone had repeatedly searched for members of an old Omega family that had quietly faded from public attention decades ago. The surname connected to those searches was not Carter. It was Ashford. Christopher immediately searched the Blackwood archives and found a single reference to that name in an index from more than 20 years ago. The corresponding file number was identical to the one Damien's late wife had requested before her death. When Christopher carried the update into Damien's office, neither man noticed Noah standing quietly outside the half-open door with Oliver sitting beside him on the carpet. The children could not understand the conversation, but Noah clearly heard one sentence. "Sir," Christopher said carefully, "I believe your wife was looking into Ethan long before any of us ever met him." Damien slowly closed the folder in front of him. If that was true, then Ethan's arrival at Blackwood Manor might not have been a coincidence at all. The unanswered questions surrounding Ethan only grew heavier as the days passed, yet nothing about the young Omega himself suggested deception. He woke before sunrise every morning, prepared breakfast alongside the kitchen staff, cared for Oliver with endless patience, and somehow always found time to sit quietly with Noah whenever the little boy reached for his hand. Damien began noticing another unusual pattern. Whenever Noah grew anxious or withdrawn, Oliver instinctively crawled toward him, rested a tiny hand on Noah's arm, and within moments the tension seemed to fade from the child's face. It happened so consistently that even Christopher quietly admitted he had never witnessed anything like it. One rainy afternoon, the children were building wooden blocks in the family library, while Ethan sorted books onto nearby shelves. A sudden clap of thunder echoed across the estate. Noah immediately froze, his breathing becoming shallow as old memories seemed to return. Before Ethan or Damien could react, Oliver toddled across the rug, wrapped both little arms around Noah's shoulder, and giggled as though inviting him into a game. Noah slowly relaxed. He looked at Oliver for several long seconds before wrapping one careful arm around the smaller child in return. Damien stood silently in the doorway, unable to ignore what he had just witnessed. The comfort his son found in Oliver seemed deeper than simple friendship. That evening, Christopher arrived with another confidential update. The investigator had located an elderly retired physician who remembered the Ashford family. According to the doctor, the Ashfords had once been respected for their unusually calming pheromone traits, a rare characteristic that many believed had disappeared years ago. There had never been scientific proof, only scattered family stories passed from one generation to the next. Christopher closed the folder after finishing the report. It could simply be folklore, he said carefully. Damien nodded, but his thoughts immediately returned to Oliver's effortless ability to calm Noah whenever fear or sadness surfaced. Before either man could continue, the estate security office requested Damien's attention. A black sport utility vehicle had been parked on the public road outside the front gate 3 separate times during the past week. It never approached the property, never caused trouble, and always left before officers could speak with the driver. The license plate belonged to a rental company, and no useful identification had been recovered. Damien instructed the security team to remain observant without alarming the household. He refused to let Noah or Oliver sense that anything unusual was happening. The following afternoon, Ethan took both children to the estate greenhouse, where colorful flowers bloomed despite the cool weather outside. Noah carefully showed Oliver how to water the small potted plants while Ethan smiled from a nearby bench. Hidden beyond the glass walls, someone quietly photographed the peaceful scene using a camera with a long-range lens before disappearing without being noticed. Hours later, Christopher received a message from the investigative team. The same rental vehicle had been connected to a private research company that specialized in tracing rare family bloodlines and historical genealogy records. There was still no evidence of criminal activity, but the repeated surveillance no longer appeared accidental. Christopher carried the report directly to Damien. After reading every page, Damien looked toward the nursery where Noah had fallen asleep beside Oliver during story time. His voice remained calm, but the decision was immediate. Double the security around the children without changing their daily routine. I do not want fear entering this house again. Christopher nodded, then paused when he noticed one final photograph attached to the report. Someone had circled Oliver with a red marker, while Noah stood beside him completely untouched. The photograph changed everything. Damien studied it long after Christopher left the office. Whoever had been watching the estate had ignored him, ignored Noah, and ignored every member of the Blackwood family. The red circle surrounded only Oliver. That single detail convinced Damien the surveillance was deliberate, not random curiosity. Without alarming Ethan, he quietly expanded the security team assigned to the nursery, the gardens, and every entrance the children used each day. He instructed the staff to make the additional protection appear invisible so Noah and Oliver could continue living without fear. Days passed peacefully on the surface. Noah grew more confident with every sunrise. He even began speaking a few simple words again. Most of them were directed toward Oliver. Come. Here. Look. Each word brought tears to the eyes of employees who remembered months of complete silence. Ethan celebrated every tiny victory as though it were the greatest gift imaginable, never realizing Damien often watched those moments from the library balcony above. The Alpha had started measuring success differently. Business contracts no longer impressed him as much as hearing his son laugh twice in the same afternoon. Christopher, however, continued following every lead connected to the missing archive and the Ashford name. Late one evening, another discovery surfaced. A retired librarian from the city archives remembered processing a request submitted years earlier under Damien's late wife's authorization. She had not borrowed one file. She had borrowed two. The first concerned the Ashford family. The second concerned the Blackwood family genealogy. According to the librarian, Mrs. Blackwood had spent several hours comparing both records before leaving with handwritten notes. Those notes had never been recovered. Damien immediately ordered the remaining family archives to be searched from top to bottom. Hidden inside an old storage room beneath the West Wing, Christopher eventually uncovered a locked wooden chest that had belonged to Damien's wife. Most of its contents were ordinary family keepsakes, children's drawings, birthday cards, and travel photographs. Tucked beneath the false bottom rested a single envelope labeled in elegant handwriting. "If anything happens before I finish, Damien must know the truth." Damien opened it with unsteady hands. Inside was only one page. There were no explanations, only a warning. It read, "Someone inside the family removed the Ashford records before I could protect them. If Ethan Carter ever appears in our lives, trust him before you trust the person who tells you not to." Damien read the sentence 3 times. His wife had known Ethan's name years before Ethan ever arrived at Blackwood Manor. More disturbing still, she believed the danger did not come from strangers outside the estate. It came from someone within the Blackwood family itself. The next morning, Damien canceled a scheduled family luncheon without explanation. Instead, he invited only Ethan, Noah, and Oliver to breakfast in the private sunroom overlooking the gardens. Ethan looked surprised by the invitation, but accepted politely. Noah sat beside Oliver as usual, carefully peeling banana slices and placing them one by one onto the baby's tray before eating his own breakfast. Damien watched the children in thoughtful silence. Across the table, Ethan smiled warmly at Noah, completely unaware of the storm quietly building around them. Christopher entered a few minutes later carrying another sealed envelope that had just arrived through a private courier. The sender had no name. Inside was a recent photograph of Oliver sleeping peacefully in the nursery. Beneath the picture, a single typed sentence read, "You are searching the past, but the child is the future." Damien slowly folded the paper, lifted his eyes toward Christopher, and spoke with absolute certainty. "The person behind this already has access to our home." Damien trusted almost no one after reading the anonymous message, yet he refused to let suspicion poison the peaceful world Noah and Oliver had built together. Instead of surrounding the children with obvious guards, he quietly changed schedules, limited access to the private wings of the manor, and required every visitor to receive advance approval. Ethan noticed only that the staff seemed unusually attentive, but whenever he asked whether something had happened, Christopher simply smiled and assured him the estate was updating routine security procedures. Ethan accepted the explanation, unaware that Damien had already begun comparing employee records against decades of family correspondence. One evening, while organizing old photographs in the manor library, Noah discovered a framed picture that had slipped behind a bookshelf. It showed his late mother standing in a flower garden beside a young Omega whose face had been partially hidden by the angle of the camera. Noah carried the photograph to Ethan without saying a word. Ethan studied it politely at first, but his expression slowly changed. His fingers trembled ever so slightly as he focused on the silver pendant hanging around the Omega's neck. It was identical to the small pendant Ethan had worn since childhood, the only possession left from the years before his memories became fragmented. Ethan quietly touched the necklace beneath his shirt, then looked back at the photograph. "I have never seen this picture before," he whispered, "but I know that pendant." Damien happened to enter the library just in time to hear those words. He carefully examined the photograph before asking where Noah had found it. Christopher searched the shelves and soon uncovered a narrow compartment hidden inside the old bookcase. The compartment was empty except for a faded inventory card indicating that several family photographs had once been stored there before being removed years earlier. Damien immediately understood that someone had deliberately taken only certain records while leaving others behind. The discovery confirmed what his wife had written. Someone inside the family had been quietly erasing pieces of the past for a very long time. Later that afternoon, Damien invited Ethan to walk through the estate gardens while Noah and Oliver chased butterflies across the lawn under the watchful eyes of the staff. Damien finally chose honesty over silence. He explained that his late wife had investigated the Ashford family years before, that her research had disappeared, and that Ethan's name had appeared in a private note written before her passing. Ethan listened without interrupting. When Damien finished, Ethan slowly shook his head. "I wish I had answers for you," he said softly. "I remember growing up with my grandmother. She always told me never to remove this pendant because one day it would help someone recognize me. She died before explaining what she meant. After that, my memories become scattered. I only remember moving from place to place, trying to build a quiet life for Oliver." Damien studied Ethan's face carefully. There was no hesitation, no attempt to invent details, only sincere frustration at not remembering more. At that moment, Noah ran toward them with Oliver happily toddling beside him. Without thinking, Noah reached for Ethan's hand while Oliver stretched both arms toward Damien, asking to be picked up. Damien lifted the little boy effortlessly, and Oliver responded with a delighted laugh before resting his head against Damien's shoulder as though it were the most natural place in the world. Ethan smiled warmly at the sight, while Noah quietly slipped his small hand into Ethan's free hand. Christopher watched from a distance, realizing that the family standing together in the afternoon sunlight looked complete long before anyone had spoken the words aloud. Yet beyond the stone walls surrounding Blackwood Manor, another pair of eyes observed the same scene through binoculars. The watcher quietly lowered the lenses, glanced at a worn photograph of Ethan as a child wearing the same silver pendant, and murmured, "They have finally found each other before the truth could be buried forever." The mysterious watcher never appeared again. Several weeks later, Christopher finally traced the anonymous messages to a retired archivist who had once worked with Damien's late wife. The elderly man came to Blackwood Manor carrying a weathered leather journal that he had protected for years because he had promised never to destroy it. He explained that Mrs. Blackwood had discovered someone quietly removing historical records connected to the Ashford family and feared that the truth would disappear forever. Before she could finish her research, she entrusted her notes to the archivist with one simple request. If Ethan Carter ever entered the Blackwood family's life willingly and with a kind heart, the journal was to be returned to Damien. Together they opened the final pages. There was no hidden fortune, no shocking inheritance, and no dangerous secret waiting to change the future. Instead, the journal revealed that the Ashford family had quietly devoted generations to helping powerful alpha families recover from grief and emotional trauma through compassion, trust, and service rather than status or influence. Mrs. Blackwood believed Ethan belonged to that forgotten family line and wrote that if fate ever reunited the two families, Damien should protect that bond instead of fearing it. She ended her final entry with a sentence that left the room silent. If our son ever smiles again because of an Ashford child, do not question the miracle. Be grateful for it. Damien slowly closed the journal and looked through the library window. Outside, Noah and Oliver were running across the lawn together while Ethan followed them with an easy smile. Noah stumbled on the grass, but before any adult could react, Oliver reached out with both tiny hands. Noah laughed, stood back up, and kept running. It was the carefree laughter of a child who had finally begun leaving sadness behind. Damien realized that every answer he had searched for had been standing in front of him from the very beginning. That evening, he invited the entire household to dinner, something the staff had never experienced before. Instead of eating separately, everyone gathered in the grand dining room. Noah surprised every person present by pulling Ethan's chair closer to his own before climbing into his seat. A few minutes later, Oliver stretched both arms toward Damien, who smiled without hesitation and lifted the little boy onto his lap until dinner was served. The room filled with warm conversation, gentle laughter, and the comforting sounds of a family discovering one another. After the meal, Noah quietly looked up at Ethan, and spoke more clearly than anyone had heard in years. "Papa Ethan." The room became perfectly still. Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he knelt beside Noah and gently embraced him. Damien rested one reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder before speaking the words his late wife would have wanted him to say. "You and Oliver came here as guests. You never have to feel like guests again. This is your home if you choose it." Ethan looked toward Oliver, then toward Noah, whose hopeful smile needed no explanation. He nodded with quiet gratitude. Months later, Blackwood Manor no longer felt like a lonely estate hidden behind iron gates. Fresh flowers decorated every room. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator in the family kitchen. Noah laughed every day. Oliver followed him everywhere like a devoted little brother. Damien found peace not through power or wealth, but through the family they had built together. The greatest mystery had never been why one child could make another smile. The true miracle was that kindness, offered without expectation, had healed hearts that had almost forgotten how to hope.